So let's talk about J.D. Vance. During the presidential campaign, Vance was really hugely important in the way that vice presidential candidates are not always. I think that his debate with Tim Walz was actually one of the turning points of the campaign. Traditionally, Americans expect their presidential candidates to be able to sort of like lay out complex programs in a systematic way, in a kind of logical way. And under ordinary circumstances, if a president can't do that, it's very hard to pick the right person for president. And this was a different kind of election, but Vance was really the only person in this election on either ticket who had that ability to, that sort of steel trap type sort of explanatory mind. So it's been interesting to see how the Trump administration has chosen to deploy that mind. And the very first assignment they gave him was to go to the Munich Security Conference in Europe, sit down with a bunch of leaders who thought of themselves as our old friends and people who could pretty much sort of like talk in an easygoing way with us, and read them the riot act. And he sure did, and you probably remember it. Vance said, and I'll quote here, he said, "The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values." And specifically, he said that Europe had become hostile to free speech. He said it was hostile to free speech because it was hostile to democracy. And he said that you could measure its hostility to democracy by the fact that for 50 years, European voters had been clamoring for less immigration and had kept getting more. Now, Europeans are not used to being talked to this way. And Vance tried to soften it by saying, we do have similar problems in the United States, but they were still taken aback. Now, the question that our Hillsdale hosts have invited me to answer today is whether J.D. Vance is right. Okay, and this is partly a simple question, and partly it partly hints at a much more complicated development. But let's deal with the simple part first. Is Europe undemocratic? Well, as Vance says, it is a lot like our situation. Europe is split between populists who tend to oppose immigration, to be upset about deindustrialization, and elitists who tend to believe that the judiciary and the bureaucracy, the regulatory state, should have a larger role in running society. An example is the main anti-immigration party in Germany right now is the Alternative for Germany. They've risen to become the country's second largest party. You have a social democratic party there that's one of the oldest parties in the West. It's been one of the top two parties in Germany since the middle of the 19th century, and the Alternative for Germany has blown the doors off them. They are now the party of the German working class. Government authorities accuse the AfD of extremism, and they've threatened them with a ban. They were barred from the Munich Security Conference, and so for that reason, Vance went out and met them. And he was much criticized for that, and actually there are reasons that you could criticize him for that. A politician on a state visit is a guest of the government, not of the opposition, and so the protocol is questionable. Still, it's a troubling sign when a party's rise leads not to the prospect of its taking office, but to the prospect of its being banned from public life. And there's been a lot of that going around lately. You know, the candidates who get this treatment tend to have a common anti-establishment profile. There is, of course, our president with his 34 felonies. There is Marine Le Pen, who only about 3 weeks ago, this is in France, she's the leader of the National Rally Party. Only 3 weeks ago, she was banned from the upcoming presidential election, in which she is the front runner in a financial scandal in which there is no allegation that anyone enriched himself. It's a financial scandal that took place between 2004 and 2016, during most of which time she wasn't even the head of the party. And it has to do with an irregularity in the method they used for paying interns in the European Parliament. For that, she's going to be banned. But I would say that at the time Vance arrived in Europe, there was a new and even more troubling case of this electoral interference that of the sort that Vance would call backsliding on democracy. And that was last November. Romania held an election. Now in Romania, Romania is one of, more than any other Eastern European country, Romania is a place where the same political establishment has remained in power since the Cold War, and the people are very impatient with it now. And there was a populist candidate named Calin Georgescu who started attacking this elite, both parties, both the center-right and the center-left part of it. He started questioning Romania's support for the war in Ukraine, and he started producing very exciting TikTok videos. And we laugh, but that's politics today. In the first round, not only did he win, but the two main establishment parties were eliminated altogether. And so it was clear that the establishment was done, no matter who won, but it looked like Georgescu was going to win. 2 days before the second round, the date of the second round, after voting had already begun, and when polls showed Georgescu winning in the polls, the Romanian authorities canceled the election on national security grounds, saying that the TikTok campaign he was running was simply too good and couldn't have been done without Russian help. And so they said they had to protect the country from Vladimir Putin and Russian disinformation. There was not one bit of concrete proof offered, and indeed the president of Romania said such proof is very, very hard to find, impossible to find was the word he used. So voters would have to take the word of the intelligence services. So the election was postponed till May. It's happening next week in Romania. And by March, it was obvious that Georgescu was ahead again, which kind of, whatever you think of the original allegations about Russian disinformation, it makes pretty clear that that was not the cause of his winning poll numbers back then. So at that point in March, the authorities arrested him and banned him from the election. This is a ban that was just upheld in another court decision the day before yesterday. Was this ban based on new evidence they'd found regarding the election last November? No, they didn't even mention the election last November. So this is the sort of thing that Vance is talking about. Is he, I mean, obviously there's controversy about it in European countries, but is he right to be worried? I mean, really. The more complicated question is, why does Vance care about this? Why is this a priority of the Trump administration? Why is it? What's it to us if Europe has less immigration, or even if the Romanian democracy is, upstanding? I mean, over the last 25 years, not just Democrats, but also, George W. Bush, they've been very concerned about, the rule of law and human rights and things like that. But I do think that a populist orientation is more about sovereignty and actually letting countries go their own way, and that actually means sort of like tolerating irregularities sometimes. But the answer as to why Trump and Vance are upset is, I think that they have come to actually a new insight about the way the world works economically and politically. And that is, in the world of the global economy, foreign politics has kind of become less national, and it's become more partisan, and this is particularly true in Europe. And when European authorities, when the European Union, when Romanian elites influence a European national election, they're also influencing a number of international bodies to which the United States belongs. NATO, most obviously, but also various bloc-to-bloc kind of trading arrangements, and also informal groups that work together at summits. And so what I would say is that what J.D. Vance suspected, and what led him to go to Europe and say this, is that when Romania overturned its election, it was not because it was worried about Vladimir Putin. It was because it was worried about Donald Trump. Now, Romania, to just stick in Eastern Europe, Romania is, aside from Europe, the pivotal country in NATO's attempt to support and arm Ukraine in its war with Russia. The American public has soured on this war and elected a president who was skeptical about it from the start. That's exactly what the Romanians tried to do in November, and it's exactly what they'll try to do as best they can next week. If they succeed, then the American understanding of the Ukrainian war will have the upper hand over the European one. And so there are certain elites in Europe who are reluctant to let that happen. Now, when we talk about Europe, we don't mean the whole continent. We mean, at least when I talk about Europe, I mean the 27 nations of the European Union. The European Union is based in Brussels. Since 1992, it's tried to take control of steering the politics of these various independent countries. It sees itself as a kind of, I don't think it's true that what Trump says, that it was set up to screw the United States. In fact, it was sort of set up by the United States. It was meant to, during the Cold War, some of these pre-European Union institutions, they were set up by the parts of the European Union that were kind of had been educated in the United States. They called themselves Atlanticists. It kind of consolidated Europe into more of a bloc. But once the Cold War was over, the word screw didn't come up, but they did want to see themselves as a rival superpower. And they started talking about, European values as if they differed from American values, and so on. Populist parties, and they have existed in Europe for longer than they have existed in the United States, they always looked at this European Union project as kind of a form of Americanization. And in a way, they were right to. The European Union helped to spread global capitalism after the mid-1980s, and we appreciated it when they did it at the time. They annulled a lot of those quirky, local regulations in Europe, which in a way are what makes Europe Europe, but they also make it really hard to do business if you're a large American company. And they helped to spread NATO in the 1990s in an interesting way. Our president's claim that Europe does not pay for its own defense is correct in terms of military budgets. But the EU has spent a good deal in other ways to consolidate NATO behind the scenes. That is, it's spent probably as much as we have on defense on structural funds, on building things for places like Romania, and building all sorts of things. And I mean traffic circles and opera houses and feminist charitable foundations and other things that make it look a little less preposterous that a country like Romania would be in NATO. Do you know what I mean? They're trying to make it look outwardly more like France or Germany. And I understand that it's that it's a Potemkin structure in a way, but there have been benefits to this process. Now, the problem is that while the EU brings benefits to a lot of these countries, the main way it does so is by destroying national sovereignty. And it seems to have, over the last 25 years ago or so, it's kind of turned these countries into sort of whimpering, simpering sort of shadows of their former national greatness. And, you know, as Vance noted, you know, 40 years ago, each of these countries had pretty for its size, had a pretty formidable military. If you were Belgium or Austria, say, would be able to put together a pretty formidable combined arms operation with, you know, robust tank brigades and serious air forces, and EU membership has made this kind of duplication between militaries, even though the military is not an EU responsibility, but the habit of EU alliance has made this duplication look wasteful. And yet, at the same time, the EU has neither the political legitimacy nor the budget to build its own military itself. So what happens actually is that these countries tend to they spend just enough on F-16s and F-35s to get to not feel guilty asking America to carry the burden of their defense, and so it feels like a good deal for all of us as long as we don't have to get tested in a major war. But but the problem is that as power shifted to Brussels, all of these countries, they were loyal allies, but they all became a lot less impressive in our eyes, and I think in their own. And I think this is a different subject which we could discuss another day, but I think that's a large part of the reason why the United Kingdom left the European Union. Other countries have wanted to. The United Kingdom was the only one that was able to overcome the many, many obstacles that were placed in the way of its actually carrying out its vote. Now, the Trump-Vance view of Europe comes with certain ironies. I mean, Trump and Vance truly believe in nationhood. They truly believe in national pride, and they truly believe in national sovereignty. And the funny thing is, it's not always going to be in our interests to beef up Europe, because the emasculation of these EU nations as nations has on occasion helped us to exploit and control them. So when Trump and Vance proposed to, improve European nations by giving them their sovereignty back, in a way, in some context, it will strengthen them against us. And we are in the role of sort of like their colonial controller in a way. You can see that happening in a bit now, but it's not, for now, over the long run, this pan-European, the European system as it exists now is not going to work. It's going to be too weak, probably, to defend the West. One aspect that I'd like to add is that the EU has tended to be a project by and for technocratic elites. And a lot of the populist discontent comes out of memories of things that have just happened in the last 2 decades. The European Union has been sort of operating this way for about 23 years. Let's say basically since the introduction of the euro at the turn of this century. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 was the beginning of the European project, really, but between a quarter and a third of the century, between 25 and 33 years. Europeans remember things like the way Angela Merkel in Germany and Nicolas Sarkozy were able to use European institutions to overthrow the Italian government during the finance crisis, or to block a referendum that would have allowed Greece to secede from the euro currency. And the European Union is mostly off stage, but it disposes of really mighty strings to pull. It plays the role that sometimes that civil rights law has played in the United States, and we've talked about this a bit at Hillsdale over the last half a century. That is, it offers a way for the alumni of the grander universities to review the democratic verdicts of the American people and decide whether they pass muster or not. And so that's the way the European Union works. The proudest boast of many European politicians is they call Europe a regulatory superpower. That's a really, it's an interesting way to look at things. They say we are a regulatory superpower. It reminds me of the way that the Swedes used to talk this way too. They used to say we are a humanitarian superpower. But this is meant to be a boast that they're a regulatory superpower. So this really gets us to the heart of the real problem that's being hashed out between Vance and, by extension, Trump and Brussels. Since roughly the Clinton administration, that is for the whole of the EU's political history, the EU has been in real harmony with the Democratic Party in the United States. They really see the world in the same way. And the result is that when Democrats are in power, in the United States has very good relationships with Brussels and very bad relationships, very hostile relationships with anti-EU Brexit-style parties in any of the European member states, and especially in Poland and Hungary. I mean, the U.S. has been like a member of the opposition when ever since Viktor Orban has come to power in Hungary, and also during the time that the Catholic Law and Justice Party was in power in Poland. And so Vance, the United States is, this is what I meant when I said at the beginning that the United States is pursuing what is more a partisan than a national foreign policy. And I think that Vance and Trump suspect that the European Union is doing the same. And the situation of Poland and Hungary is again the most interesting. After the migration crisis of 2016, when you had 1 million Syrians walking over land into Europe, this anti-immigration populist Catholic party in Poland, Law and Justice, got a grip on the Polish government, and they pursued a tight immigration policy, and they pursued a justice reform, and it looked like they would be very difficult to dislodge. But during COVID, the EU was able to pass a $1 trillion stimulus and rescue plan. And although it was meant to be an emergency fund with no political strings attached, the EU decided to withhold the $60 billion in aid that Poland was owed. $60 billion in Poland is a tremendous amount of money. It's about $1 trillion to the in the United States. And so you had an election in 2023 in which you had the Law and Justice Party, which had no chance of getting this $1 trillion, and the Civic Platform, which is the more center-left party, which was guaranteed this $1 trillion. I mean, and it's a funny kind of election. It's a funny election to have under those circumstances. People talk about free and fair elections. In retrospect, these elections were free, but they were not fair. That is, Brussels held financial tools that placed Poland at its mercy. So I would say that what's happened is that Trump and Vance have taken notice of this. And when they see the EU waving through an election in Romania that's an order of magnitude more corrupt than anything that's ever been done in Poland, they kind of smell a rat. So what do they think? As I say, they think the EU's actions are not about Putin. They think they're about Trump. And that the EU is turning into a machine to deprive the United States of allies on the international stage, and that it's using the networked nature of these international conclaves to sabotage American positions. I would say that the Trumpian view of the global economy that Vance has been representing, it's quite consistent. Whether you like it or not, it's quite consistent, and it's of a piece with his understanding of the national economy. It's kind of hard to explain, but he doesn't view the global economy as a society. When we were all, I think, we all grew up to think of the economy as just like, we're all in the economy. The economy is just what we do when we're making money as opposed to when we're, in church or playing sports or something. Trump, I think, actually thinks of the economy not as a culture, but as a kind of a network of operators. And that some people control it and some people don't. And I think that he's proceeding accordingly, both in his diplomacy and in his reform of the administrative state. I think I think this drives his thinking on tariffs, and I think it drives his thinking on reforming the State Department. A couple of days ago, in fact, when Marco Rubio announced that he would cut 132 offices out of the State Department. I don't know if you noticed what he said, but he said he was focusing on agencies that served as a platform for left-wing activists to wage vendettas against, quote, anti-woke leaders in nations such as Poland, Hungary, and Brazil. This is interesting. I mean, the way Rubio uses the word woke. An interesting element of the half year, this is the last point I'll make about Europe since Trump's election, is that the United States has overthrown woke, I believe, but that it hasn't really convinced other countries to do the same. I mean, I've been in Ireland and France and Germany, and it actually seems as strong as ever. In England, there's been a partial pushback, I think, against transgenderism, but really woke is still in the saddle over there. I think this tends to vindicate the sort of Trump view of how the world works, that woke is actually not a culture. It's not something that spreads through argument and influence and example. It is actually a system of power. It doesn't rest on convictions. It rests on the power of the government or the power of the boss to threaten the job of the person who's being hired. But that's the battle that's underway. In March, there was a poll of European Union citizens that found a majority now consider Trump a, quote, enemy of Europe, versus just 9% who see him as a friend. Europeans now often say of Americans, what Americans said of Islamists during the George W. Bush administration, that the problem is they hate our values. I think it was wrong then. I think it's wrong now. I think that the problem is not really values. The problem is really interests. American and European progressive elites have made themselves partisan actors in the other's politics, assuming that Republicans and other populists would be too dim to notice, and for decades this assumption did prove correct, by the way. But now that things are changing, I think that friction is the natural result, let's say. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. We now have time for Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you.
Thank you.
Oh, I have to hold it.
Oh, you have to hold it?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I see one, yeah.
So I read your book, The Age of Entitlement.
Yeah. Where are you?
Right here.
Ollie. Yeah.
And I was impressed, and it reminded me of that other book, The Origin of Woke. My question to you is the Civil Rights Act was corrupted by the lower courts, I believe you were saying. I'm wondering if the lower courts were composed of people that were ideologically woke, indoctrinated. I'm wondering how that, with the culture and the whole neo-Marxist invasion, influenced those lower courts, the lawyers, the schools that they were going to, and that contributed to the corruption of the Civil Rights Act.
Well, here we go on a very huge subject that we could talk for half an hour about, but I think that I do not really think that there was corruption on the courts at the very beginning. I think it is sort of one of these tragedies of good intentions mostly. I think it's a sort of a tragedy of American can-do spirit. I mean, if you look at, I think that the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act has a lot in common with the Vietnam War. That it's a big project with a lot of actual ideals behind it, and a country that was really flushed with just tremendous, unbelievable successes, things no country had ever done, winning, simultaneous wars against two military superpowers, on the other side of opposite oceans, and then, create an economy that was creating, 50% of the world's industrial production for a while. It's like, we can do anything. And I think that we thought that some of these difficult, moral questions could be solved as easily as some of these, not that the material questions were easy, but we felt that they were within our grasp in the way that the material questions were, and that we could not only spread our idea of democracy in Southeast Asia, but we could also, fix this American race problem on which, some of the smartest and most sensitive Americans had sort of broken themselves over 300 or 400 years. So I think that people are just inclined to give it a go. I mean, I think that they were mostly, it was kind of LBJ was a New Dealer. He wound up. I mean, he started as a New Dealer. He wound up, I think, in a place that was very different. He wound up detaching his reforms from the, let's say, the world of the working man, which FDR remained anchored in. But I think that it was can-do spirit rather than corruption. Now, not to make this sound like too rosy an answer, we went down several wrong trails. The problem was that, the civil rights Act of 1964 was an attempt to, do justice to the 14th Amendment. But a lot of what we did in civil rights wound up violating the spirit of the 14th Amendment and equal, citizenship. And a lot of the recent jurisprudence about, affirmative action has sort of like shown how that happened. But, we wound up really turning it into an alternative, as I've said, into a second constitution that could be used to overrule the first. It became a shortcut to social reform, and it spread way beyond civil rights. And there was really no natural limit to it anymore. And it kind of took over the whole society. But it's a long story, and I'm sorry that I can't really come to the end of it in one answer of a few minutes, but thank you for the question. Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Over the last few months, we've seen growing evidence of the involvement of both American and foreign NGOs and intelligence services in the United States electoral process, and especially the coordinated efforts by some of these European intelligence agencies and NGOs with respect to domestic American politics. So, for example, centralized censorship operations on social media, electoral interference. How much of that is motivating J.D. Vance's comments? And then secondly, what do you see as the Trump administration's efforts to end that interference and bring some of these European groups, a little bit more under control?
Yeah, this is not a subject on which I have a great deal of specific knowledge, so I can't, I don't know how that has worked in the United States. But your point about, the interconnectedness, particularly in the internet age, of some of these practices and a lot of the surveillance of the internet is well taken. There's a guy who I think has been very influential in the Trump administration named Mike Benz, who writes a lot about these internet observatories, these some of these things that profess to, in his view, I think the real the dangerous first step was the reinvention of the concept of misinformation and disinformation, of bad information. And so once you have that concept, it doesn't look like censorship to the people practicing it anymore. It looks like just keeping good democratic hygiene and that kind of thing. We're protecting the quality of our public debate and that kind of thing. And if you do that, that's the sort of thing that if most of your information is traveling on the internet, it's a very efficient way for countries to to influence other countries' politics. And so as I say, I'm not an expert on this, but if you look at what Benz looks at, it's mostly things like, there are a lot of English, for instance, internet disinformation organizations that monitor American American speech, and they create dossiers of disinformation, which are very useful for people, who are running tax-exempt, litigation shops in the United States to use to compile briefs. And I don't know that it should be, I don't know that it's illegal. And I don't know that it can be, I don't know how it can be limited in a country with the First Amendment. But it does affect the way we understand the international system that we are in. And I would say you're absolutely right that is one of the big, probably one of the big factors that's motivating Vance, although I haven't heard him say it explicitly.
Question to the speakers, right?
Yeah? Huh?
Hi, good morning. There's a lot of activity going on in Rome this week with the funeral and then the selection of the next pope. In my opinion, the selection of the next pope is going to be very critical for the survival of Europe. I wanted to get your thoughts on the selection of the next pope, and I read some articles that the selection of the next pope should not come from anyone in Europe, which was an interesting article I read. So.
That's interesting. You know, this takes it a little bit. This is a little bit outside my area of expertise. Yeah, I've been interested in the last pope's sort of attitude towards, you know, the selection of a pope is it's a religious matter. I mean, I think that the pope can have political influence. I don't know how much influence Francis had. Seriously, it's very hard for me to measure. If you compare him to a pope like John Paul II, I mean, John Paul II obviously inspired people along a certain path. He inspired Catholics to, let's say, he inspired Catholics to sort of like stand up and speak for human dignity in Eastern Europe and that sort of thing. Francis's engagements with immigration and the environment, I think they're influential in a different way. I think that they built up the church in Latin America and in Africa and also in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia. And so quite naturally, I mean, he didn't invent this trend. These parts of the world are where, you know, all the growth in Catholicism is. And so from that perspective, it would be a kind of a natural thing if the church moved in that direction. But it's a religious thing, and it's not a it's not a political thing that I could really weigh in on. Yes. Yeah.
Chris, you wrote in Primus a couple of years ago about the embrace of the Ukrainian cause by the establishment, and you said part of it, at least, is due to the desire to drag Vladimir Putin into the midst of American politics for the purpose of discrediting Donald Trump. Do you still believe that?
Yes. I remember that, and it's so great to see you, Dwight. Dwight and I are old friends here, and this is he's the person I know best in Kansas City. But you know, I remember going to actually Phoenix and giving a talk about Putin to a Hillsdale group, and it was in, I believe, January of 2017. And we'd planned this talk like a year before. No one ever, it was just like a foreign affairs type talk. And this stuff was coming out, this intelligence committee assessment, the intelligence community assessment that, you know, about Russian influence on the 2016 election. And I read it. I thought, should I include something about this in the talk? And I looked it over, and I read this 12-page pamphlet, and it seemed to consist of sort of people who had watched Russian TV and seen a couple of Russian TV personalities who were making fun of Hillary Clinton. And so since a couple of Russian TV personalities wanted Hillary Clinton to win, and since we all know Russian TV is influenced by Russian government, it must be true that Vladimir Putin was trying to steal the 2016 election. And I thought, I don't really have to talk about this. This is not really serious enough to affect anything in American life. And boy, was I wrong. I do think that, you know, I think most Americans would not. This is not an endorsement of Vladimir Putin, but most Americans would not want to, you know, live in Russia, just as most Russians would not want to live in America. But I think that a lot of he's become a kind of an all-purpose kind of like let's say, occasion for fundraising and excuse for corner cutting and distraction. And so I don't, we've now got there's an awful lot of water under the bridge. I think that this is such a large. I don't mean to bring up the war. The short answer to your question, Dwight, is yes. I mean, what I was worried about. What is very worrying. Well, I won't go into the war right now. But yes, you're right. I think it is. I think it's still a problem in American life. Thanks.
Could you comment on the success of Nigel Farage's Reform Party in England and its impact on the politics there, and whether he might have a chance of turning England conservative?
Yeah. I mean, I think that Farage was, there have been a few stages of it. I remember meeting Farage when he was with a party called UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which was the first big party that tried to take people out of the European Union. He's always been a great speaker, and during Brexit, there were two, I think, big tendencies in Brexit. One was the pro-Brexit Tories, who tended to be kind of elite establishment politicians who thought that Britain could really be let's just say a free market powerhouse without the constraints of the European Union, and these people provided a lot of the, let's say, the intellectual heft to the movement for Brexit. But I think that the vast bulk of the British population was brought along by Nigel Farage and his movement, and which later became the Reform Party. The people who did not like deindustrialization, who did not like the mass immigration and its effects in England. England is a very special place. It's in a couple of ways. Geographically, it's very limited in space, and the UK is now moving towards about 70 million people, or maybe higher. Maybe it's up to closer to 75, and about 60 or so of which live in England, which is a tiny country. And there's great geographical inequality, so that London is one of the richest cities in the world, but the places north of it are would be close to the poorest country in Europe. So there are a lot of populist grievances going. Farage is their main guy. Farage has got some there's something similar to Trump here, okay? Farage has got some problems. Not everyone likes Farage, and Farage is, they've got, I think, 5 or 6 members of parliament since the last election, and Farage has got kind of rivalrous with some of them, and there are some members of the party who say, well, maybe we could have like a more intellectual version of Nigel Farage, or maybe we could have a version of Nigel Farage that drank less. But I think that, or something like that. But I think that he's the guy. I mean, so for now, Farage is the populist candidate in England. And so if anyone does it, and the English electoral system now is in terrible flux. You have a government that was formed by a Labour Party that got 1/3 of the votes and was rewarded with 2/3 of the seats. And Farage got, I don't know what he got in, I forget what was his vote tally last time. He got well into the teens, and he's only got a handful of seats. And so it's a wacky electoral system, but it's one that's given to big surprises. And if anyone can pull it off, it's probably him.
In your opinion, how much does the European Union establishment how responsible are they in driving the anti-Semitic fervor here in the United States?
Well, it's an interesting question. My first answer would be not very. I think that in the 25 years ago, during the Second Intifada, let's just say in the first decade of this century, we had a pattern going on in the Middle East wars where the United States backed Israel, but the European Union was the main force for like rebuilding Palestine. And every time Israel bombed the West Bank or Gaza, the European Union would build new, apartment buildings and schools and universities and things. And they spent a ton of money, and they got very emotionally invested in Palestine, and they got very angry at Israel. And there was just like a real, let's say, there was a kind of a constant level of tension, I think, between Europe and Israel. I think that obviously Israel has become is embroiled in controversy still, and maybe more than it has ever been. And obviously there is hostility to Israel in Europe. I mean, certainly you look at the size of some of the marches in London, and they're quite serious. But I do not think that it's any longer at the official level. What it really is the blossoming of the migration that has been mostly from the Arab world into being a part of the European continent. So I'd say it's two groups. One is the children of Muslim immigrants who are looking for some kind of connection to the world that their parents left, and the other is, and this does have a connection to our campus unrest, young intellectuals and that kind of thing. But I do not think that it's really a preponderant tendency in Europe.
We have time for one more question.
Question to the speaker is right.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for your analysis of the problem that we have in Europe and Trump and Vance's evaluation of that. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to evaluate and analyze a situation or problem. It's another thing to propose solutions. And could you speak, do you know of what President and Vice President are considering in terms of addressing this problem and bringing a solution to it?
I think that it basically has, I think it basically has three levels of different, let's say three aspects. The first is this national one. I think that they are more comfortable with nations than they are with multinational organizations. And they think that the EU has the feeling of a multinational organization. And, you notice that Ursula von der Leyen, who is the titular, supreme executive of the European Union, doesn't figure as much in transatlantic diplomacy as she used to. So that's one part of it. The second part of it, I think, is military, and maybe this is being done in a kind of a formulaic way. The sort of like the urging that Europe, spend 2% of its GDP. All these countries each spend 2% of its GDP on defense. Some countries are really going to town, doing great. I think Poland is up to like 4%. Greece and Turkey are very high. I mean, counting Turkey as a NATO member, but they're high because they're sort of like they're considering using them on one another. You know, I mean, it's not a. But other countries are disappointing. France is in desperate budget shape, and you know, France used to always be the backbone of the continental military, and it's not. It's weakening, and Britain, if you remove their nuclear deterrent from their defense percentages, is below 2% itself. So it's not really the success story it looks like. So Europe has to build up its defense. I'm not sure if it's helpful when Trump starts talking about saying like, well, they should go to 5%. That I think that this is, I guess, what they call anchoring bias in deal making term. You try and create an anchoring bias, and then the guy will come away and he'll say he'll do 4%, and he'll feel he's won, you know. But so that's another one, the military, and then I think the other thing is the economic order. I think that they want assurance that that Europe is on the American side in what Trump sees as the coming conflict with China. I mean, I hope it's not a conflict, but in that it is Europe's need for China is quite pronounced, and this is especially true of Germany. Germany and China had an extraordinarily fruitful trade relationship. Germany was building the factories for China. It was Germany's best product, arguably a better product than its cars. And the way for its national economy. I mean, I personally would rather have a German car than a Chinese factory, but it was important to Germany, and I think that the Ukraine war has complicated a lot of these relationships because we've asked Germany to do without its cheap source of cheap energy and its best, export customer. So I think that now that we are losing our commitment to the Ukraine war, and pretty much Germany could go back to, buying Russian gas again. I think they might say, why can't we go back to selling factories to, China again? So those I think are the three big things: nationhood, defense, the economic order.